Melanie, thank you so much for joining me here on Testing Insights. Do you want to quickly introduce yourself, just how you're relevant in talking about experimentation program management? Yeah.
Yeah, sure. So first of all, thanks for having me. I'm Melanie Kirkland. I currently work as Group Experimentation Lead at Specsavers, which is one of the world's largest global optical retailers. So we service our customers online and through a large retail network of stores in 10 countries. And well, I've been in experimentation for 11 years, in digital for even longer than that. So I've really been in CRO since the nascent phases of this industry. I've seen it grown into a more mature discipline over the years. But interestingly, I also see the same themes cropping up around how to do experimentation well, how to scale, and how to best foster an experimentation culture. So these come up repeatedly at a number of businesses I've worked at.
Yeah, so my set of questions for you aim to take advantage of your experience there. So they're around strategy and culture and some of the pitfalls and how it works, how it doesn't, and things like that. So the first question, thinking about how what are your views on how experimentation programs should work and function across channel owners? So this is a little bit of like how do you view structures of experimentation programs type of question, hub and spoke, centralized, decentralized, center of excellence. So any kind of implications, learnings that you've had, and storytelling would be great if you could do that. But yeah, what are your thoughts on, specifically how it works to enable across channels this experimentation function?
Yeah, interesting question. So I think some of the perspective I can bring is from having worked at a lot of large global organizations. So what I've learned works best is yes, you have a global function that is anchored in global platform development and global solutions, but you also need that local partnership. I think that's really important. So the way I make it work across markets and also between product and marketing functions is also to actively partner with local businesses in order to understand their market, their goals, and being able to translate that dimension into scalable and global solutions. So at Specsavers, for example, I interface predominantly with the group product development. So I'm really building that program bottom up, bringing that a very sort of detailed knowledge of the user and their needs, and how our optimization strategy and product development need to align to servicing those needs. And then the second dimension I'm bringing is really the market perspective as well, and how we can help them reach their market and their user goals. So I'd say it's a combination of 80% global, but bring that 20% of local perspective in, and never approaching global solutions without having a good understanding of your global market as well.
So I want to real quick poke on that question around like the global versus the regional, or sort of the
Mm-hmm.
local, and the way that you put it almost as well as like product versus marketing in a way. So I've seen, for example, experimentation programs be birthed from the marketing side of things. As an agency,
Yeah.
we see a ton of that. And when
Mm-hmm.
it's there, it's more customer focused, a little bit more customer centric.
It is.
The experiments are, the metrics, the strategies, how things get prioritized are different than if it births from that
Mm-hmm.
product side. Um,
Yeah.
so I guess this is it's actually leads right into my second question. So I was going to sub question this out on question one, but this is related to the second question: is does your experimentation culture come top down, or is it focused on this subset of channels? Meaning, you know, is there kind of an overarching
Mm-hmm.
priority bucket that, okay, the company is driving, this is the growth model of the company as a whole,
Mm-hmm.
and this is how product, marketing, data kind of uh, roll up to that overall growth strategy and the priorities at the top level? Or do you see a little bit more, and this could your current with Specsavers or some of the other programs that you've been a part of, do different channels just roll on their own? And then how do you rectify like the prioritization to that kind of top down approach?
So I think ideally you need to have a bit of both. So let's say from a product perspective, I think it's important to have mature operations developing the functionality and the core user journey for customers. Then the growth model and the marketing perspectives that you bring into this, they sort of add the journey perspective to what you're doing. So for example, if you want to solve for retention, if that's a key growth lever within what you're doing, and for most companies it is, then the aspects of the marketing journey and the product experience that you pull in are different and that you are optimizing for. So in terms of looking at marketing and product cohesively, I see the two coexisting.
Mm-hmm.
And from an organizational perspective, well, I'll speak to Specsavers because that's where I'm currently working. There, it's a retail company. It's used to being agile and moving fast. And I think top down, there is the cultural aspect of testing everything. Now, are we all testing and using experimentation consistently across the business? I don't think we're there yet. And I think I've seen posts of yours, and I know you're a believer of experimentation as a business function. And that is kind of the approach I want to start fostering a bit to, foster that culture across the organization, and maybe start speaking to marketing and say, okay, how are you testing within your channels? What are your goals? And then making them aware of how I'm doing experimentation to see if there's ways we can work together in order to solve some of those problems around retention and acquisition and join forces. And similarly, I think I could speak to the technology companies who are putting retail functionality into our stores to see how they're approaching testing. So really taking a consultative approach and looking at experimentation as a package of services that I can start taking to the business in order to understand if there's ways we can work together and start doing experimentation together. So I think from a siloed perspective, everyone's testing, but do we have a common approach to experimentation and problem solving? Probably not yet, but that's something I want to start testing the waters.
From an engagement standpoint, this is a bit of an aside real quick. I was just, what you say reminds me of a conversation I had yesterday with Chad Sanderson. He's working at Convoy and ex-Microsoft, and he talked about at Convoy, it's so top down, this experimentation culture, that they have an incentivization program. The bonuses are tied to basis points lifts as measured within experiments. So it's incentivized in such a direct way, a focus on metrics and a focus on experimentation, that I've been watching him talk about quasi experiments over the last month or so, and it clicked in my head. That's why they came up with new ways to experiment because it's so incentivized to measure and to figure out ways to measure these hard to measure things. So it's a bit of an aside for like this, how you approach and how you engage. What you talked about there, it could be represent a bit of a hack, but an interesting one, maybe a controversial one as well. My third question is about a little bit more tactical, but you mentioned my third question is, how do you see communicating experiment program goals and learnings out across the teams? You mentioned, for example, if you focused on retention, if a group focuses on retention, you've got okay, so you set this group, this is what you're focusing on. Let's set up a quarter, like OKR system or something to focus on this problem of retention, for example. Let's measure it out. And then how are you communicating that outward in that hypothetical? How are you using the communication pieces to get the engagement? Can you say anything about like the artifacts and rituals around the communication of the learnings that you've seen be successful?
Yeah, so in terms of communicating learnings, well, something we're doing quite well at Specsavers is to have a channel where anyone who's involved in optimization globally is able to post their learnings. We also have a whole cadence of meetings, either between ecom and global teams, as well as the whole marketing organization. So we are definitely socializing the learnings. Something which I find more interesting is socializing the process a bit more. I think focusing on learnings, people don't start understanding the value of the end-to-end process that we're going through, the amount of data that we're analyzing, the research we're doing, which brings us to this coherent picture of what we're going after and what metrics and what behavior we're trying to alter through experimentation. So I think in order to sort of evangelize experimentation, you need to focus on the process and even better on the problem space. So all the information you've processed in order to come to this sort of coherent, very coherent picture of what should be worked on and why. And I think from a leadership perspective, if you can articulate that very well, it's very powerful to get people collaborating with you and dividing and conquering against the goals you've set. So it's really about that well articulated and clear picture of the problem space, what you're going after and why.
Yeah, I like that a lot. It was elegantly said. Cool. So my last question here, what do you see as the biggest obstacle in experimentation program ROI? Like you've got an experimentation program, it needs to have ROI. What is the biggest obstacle? What comes to mind?
Well, if you're looking at experimentation within the e-commerce space, obviously growth is affected by a number of factors. So you have your traffic dimension, your demand dimension, as well as your basket value as well, which is subject to pricing changes, external factors. So I think in communicating the ROI for experimentation, so it's kind of tough because you can state your incremental revenue figures, but then stakeholders don't start seeing that in their bottom line, especially if you're in a complex retail organization where demand and price may be shifting quite regularly. So I would say focusing on that monetary value and ROI can be a hard one when you're dealing with a global retail business because it's subject to a lot of market and internal forces as well, and levers that you're not necessarily in charge of.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So it's on, yeah, and there's different, you focused on the monetary kind of definition of ROI, which is like that's the right on point or right on the nose. When sometimes I'm curious about ways to translate it on the non-monetary, but the sort of investment and the engagement and the cultural side, cultural innovations, for example, side of these programs, and how I could just improve efficiencies, time savings, stuff like that, which are harder to measure. It's not like what we typically bucket under ROI, but well, thank you, Melanie. This is great. Real quick set of questions. Thank you for joining the call here and going through this with me.
Yeah, it was great talking to you. Thanks.